Welcome to my channel, The Medusa Effects, where you can hear the crimes that petrify the society. Something's wrong at the Parker house. In the quiet town of Maple Hollow, Wisconsin, people still left their doors unlocked. Until the spring the smell began. First, nobody said anything. Folks chalked it up to the thawing earth, dead coyotes in the woods, old pipes. But by the second week of April, complaints began trickling into the sheriff's office. A sour, metallic stink, one neighbor said. Like roadkill and bleach, another added. And the smell? It was coming from the neat little blue house at the end of Frostberry Lane. A house that belonged to Marion Parker. A woman known for her warm smile, homemade stews, and quiet loneliness. Her husband had disappeared 3 months earlier, but she'd assured everyone he'd run off to Colorado with some waitress. Nobody loved gossip more than Maple Hollow, and still, no one pushed too hard. But now the smell was different. It wasn't just bad. It was wrong. On the evening of April 19th, deputies Liam Harker and Celeste Moreno were dispatched to conduct a welfare check and investigate the odor complaint. Marion answered the door wearing an oversized cardigan and a strange, airy smile, like she'd been waiting for them. "Evening, officers. I know why you're here. It's my drains," she said before they could speak. She didn't ask who called. She didn't act surprised. She stepped aside and calmly let them in. Inside, the house was spotless. Too spotless. Bleach stung the back of Celeste's throat. But Liam caught something else. Underneath the sterilized floors and open windows, something darker hung in the air. Not sewage. Not garbage. Decay. The kitchen was cozy but cramped. All pale cabinets and ceramic trinkets. On the stove simmered a massive, black cast-iron soup pot, lid sealed tight. Steam curled from the sides. Marion noticed Celeste looking at it. Her smile didn't move, but her eyes hardened. "Leftovers," she said. "I cook big batches to save money." Liam asked politely to have a look around the house. Marion hesitated, then nodded. "Of course, but please be respectful. My husband left enough chaos behind. I don't need more." She said it like she was rehearsing it. They didn't plan to go down there. Not yet. But on their way through the narrow hallway, they passed a basement door secured with a heavy outside latch. Not a lock. A latch like you'd use for a kennel, or something you didn't want opening from the inside. Liam stopped. Marion froze. "Just storage," she said quickly. But the smile was gone now. Celeste glanced at the pot again, then at the latch. Her instincts screamed. They didn't open it. Not yet. She was calm, cooperative, no signs of immediate threat. Without a warrant and without sounds or visible cause, procedure tied their hands. But as they turned to leave, Marion added something strange. "You don't need to come back. The smell will be gone soon." She said it softly, as if it were a promise or a warning. Marion's husband, Douglas Parker, wasn't exactly well liked. He'd been fired from the town's mill for drinking on shift and rumored to have gambling debt. When Marion said he'd left, people believed it because they wanted to. But what she didn't mention, he vanished the week before their 25th anniversary. His truck was still in their garage. His phone last pinged in Maple Hollow. No one ever filed a missing person report. Not Marion. Not his brother. Not anyone. Because when men like Douglas disappear, some folks call it a fresh start, not a crime. The next morning, Officer Harker returned alone to question Jeanette Greeley, the neighbor who first complained. She was a retired nurse with a failing memory, but a sharp sense of smell. She lowered her voice as though the house itself could hear. "Something ain't right with that woman," she said. "3 nights I heard banging, like someone pounding from inside the floorboards." Liam stiffened. "Did you report that?" She swallowed. "I told myself it was the pipes. Then I said maybe it was raccoons. But pipes don't beg. Raccoons don't cry." She wiped her eyes with shaking fingers. "And twice, she brought that pot outside. The big black one, stirring it on a camping burner at dawn." "Who does that?" Deputies filed a formal request for a search warrant, citing odor, reports of unusual sounds, and suspicious behavior. While the paperwork crawled through the system, Marion kept cooking. 3 days later, dispatch took a call from a grocery clerk at Hanson's Market. A woman, calm, polite, well-dressed, had purchased 15 industrial boxes of lye, peroxide, and heavy-duty bags. When asked what it was for, she smiled and said, "I'm finally cleaning up what's left of my marriage." They ran her plates from the parking lot. It was Marion. That was all they needed. At 7:42 p.m., 6 officers arrived with a signed warrant. As they stepped from their cruisers, the smell hit them before the wind could carry it off. Marion answered the door with the same cardigan, but her hair was still damp, like she'd just showered or washed something off. She didn't fight, didn't shout, didn't even ask why they were there. She just said, "You're too early." 2 deputies moved to secure her while Harker and Moreno headed straight for the kitchen. The stove was still warm. The pot was still there. And this time, it wasn't sealed. Celeste didn't touch it. She didn't have to. She leaned in, closed her eyes, then looked at Liam. The smell was unmistakable now. Not garbage. Not animal. Human. Harker called it in as possible remains. Forensics was already en route. But while documenting the scene, a young officer noticed something else. The latch on the basement door, it was unhooked. Not by them, not by force, but recently, the wood around the screws was splintered from the inside. Something or someone had tried to get out. The officers shared a glance. Guns drawn, flashlights up. Harker gave the order. "We check the basement. Now." They opened the door. A cold draft crawled up the stairs. And then they heard it. Not footsteps, not breathing. A wet, dragging shuffle, followed by a low, broken voice. From the dark. "Help! Please!" She said she'd finish me after the soup was done. The basement door groaned as it opened, the hinges protesting like they hadn't been touched in months. The wooden steps were narrow, steep, and slick with something no one wanted to identify just yet. Deputy Celeste Moreno led with her flashlight while Harker covered her from behind, weapon drawn. The smell hit them a second later. Not the sour burn from the kitchen. This was colder, older, sadder. As the beam of light cut across the basement floor, it landed on a hunched figure in the corner. Shirtless, shivering, knees pulled to his chest. His skin looked waxy, half-rotted, but somehow still alive. Chains wrapped around one ankle, bolted to a support beam. His lips barely moved. She wouldn't let me talk. Celeste crouched low, not too close, speaking softly. "Sir, can you tell me your name?" He blinked slowly, as though each movement cost him years. Douglas Parker." Liam froze. Her husband. The man everyone believed ran off without a word. The man no one looked for. But this wasn't the face from his old driver's license. He'd lost at least 70 pounds. His hair was uneven, roughly chopped with kitchen scissors. His left arm was in a homemade sling. Deep red grooves wrapped his wrists like bracelets of infection. He pointed upward with one trembling finger, toward the kitchen. She cooked like nothing was wrong. Celeste's voice went thin. "Douglas, what's in the pot?" His breathing stuttered. His eyes darted to the shadows behind them like someone else might still be down there. "That's not me up there." While paramedics swarmed the basement, another team remained in the kitchen. Marion sat in handcuffs at the dining table, calmly watching them work. She didn't ask about her husband. She didn't protest the warrant. She kept her eyes on the pot as though it were the only thing that mattered. Forensics lifted the lid. Every officer in the room stepped back. Inside was a thick, grayish broth swirling with fatty globs and something that might have once been tissue. Bones, small, discolored, floated like driftwood. At first glance, it looked like animal remains. But the human eye is wired to recognize its own. One femur fragment, a molar, a child-sized rib. No one said a word. Across the room, Marion hummed. Detective Rowan Hale arrived minutes later, his face unreadable as he spoke to Harker. "Paramedics have him stabilized. He's malnourished, dehydrated, but conscious." Says he was kept down there since January. Parker glanced toward the basement door. That smell started 2 weeks ago. Hale nodded. He already knew what that meant. Which means whoever was in that pot isn't him. Marion's head tilted like she was listening. Without being spoken to, she said softly, "You people act like you don't waste meat every day." Nobody responded. She smiled. A rookie officer named Porter searched the pantry and opened the deep freezer beside the washer. He expected frozen peas, chicken, ice. Instead, he found zipper bags, neatly stacked, labeled with dates, each one vacuum-sealed with pieces of something pale and marbled. He counted 14 bags. Porter backed away so fast he slipped on the tile. Marion watched him and exhaled like a mother disappointed in a clumsy child. Those were supposed to last until summer. Later that night, they brought in Douglas to identify the remains from the pot. He was too weak to stand, so they showed him a photo of one of the recovered bones. His eyes filled with a kind of dread detectives never get used to. She said it was her project. Some girl who came selling cookies. She didn't let her leave. The room fell silent. No missing child reports had been filed in Maple Hollow in over a decade. If the girl wasn't local, she might have passed through with a school group or church event. Marion offered no name. She just stared at the wall like she could see something happening on the other side of it. And then, almost wistfully, "I told her not to scream, but they always scream." Celeste left the room before she could throw up. When detectives finally sat down with Marion, she didn't lawyer up. She didn't cry. She didn't refuse to speak. She was disturbingly chatty, but only in circles. Hale tried to keep her on track. "Why did you lock your husband in the basement?" Marion shrugged. "He couldn't behave upstairs." "What does that mean?" "He wouldn't stop going through my things." "What things?" Her eyes flicked toward the kitchen. "My recipes." He pressed further. "Marion, who was in the pot?" She smiled, a slow, dreamy curve of the lips. "You should check the garden." Hale frowned. "Why the garden?" Now she leaned forward, cuffs clinking, voice dropping to a whisper that felt colder than the basement air. "Because I only cooked the ones I couldn't bury." By dawn, cadaver dogs were in the backyard, scratching near the lilac bushes and the tool shed. The soil was uneven in certain spots, softer than the rest. There were sunk-in impressions like something had once weighed the earth down. Neighbors gathered behind police tape, whispering prayers and rumors. Some swore they'd seen her carry heavy buckets at night. Others said she'd always been odd after her mother died. But the dogs led them beyond the yard, to the edge of the tree line behind the fence. They found the first shallow grave within minutes. Inside were partial remains, the bones cleaned of flesh, as though the body wasn't buried immediately. "Not murder," one detective said. "A harvest." Another officer vomited in the shrubs. As they led her to the transport van, Marion paused at the kitchen doorway and glanced back at the stove. "I hope you turned off the burner," she said gently. "Wouldn't want the rest to overcook." No one asked what the rest meant, because they were too afraid she'd answer. Detective Rourke didn't hear the bullpen noise anymore, just the ticking of the wall clock and the faint hum of the ventilation as he replayed Marion Parker's last words in his head. The way her voice dipped when she mentioned Stephen Halvorson, like she was afraid the name itself could summon him, and when Detective Mira came back from evidence with the sealed container holding the remains pulled from the soup pot, she didn't speak at first, just looked at Rourke like she was about to say something he wouldn't want to hear, and he muttered, "Go on?" Without looking up, and she said quietly, "It's not animal bone. The lab confirmed human tissue and cartilage, possibly juvenile. They're running mitochondrial DNA now." And Rourke felt something sour in his chest, something that usually meant the case was about to split open in the worst way, and before he could answer, Captain Sloan pushed through the glass door, jaw clenched, saying, "You two need to hear this." Another call just came in about Marion 20 years back. Missing foster kids, unlicensed care, reports buried, and he didn't even finish before Mira said, "Halvorson buried them." And Sloan didn't deny it, just nodded like a man who'd seen it coming. Meanwhile, Dr. Havers stood in the basement of the medical examiner's office with the fragment trays under bright forensic lighting. Talking into his recorder, cranial segment shows clean separation, thermal exposure prior to dismemberment, likely stewed over time. And the tech across the table swallowed too loud and whispered, "There's more in the drain filters, they're still sorting." And Havers didn't respond, just kept observing as though distance could keep the horror from sticking to him. But his hands trembled slightly when he adjusted the magnifier. Upstairs, Detective Mira dug through archived case files. Back when Marion volunteered at Halvorsen House. Back when unclaimed minors disappeared and no one filed the right papers, and she muttered, "He had the pull, he could erase entire children." And Rourke said, "Then why leave her to take the fall?" And Mira said, "Maybe she was never supposed to talk again." And that's when the phone on Rourke's desk rang, old landline tone, cutting through the stale air like a knife. And he answered, "Rourke." And a voice disguised with a modulator said, "You're digging where you shouldn't." And Rourke said, "Is this Halvorsen?" But the line clicked dead. At the same time, across town in Marion's abandoned farmhouse, forensics combed the kitchen again, and Officer Haynes opened the pantry floorboards after noticing fresh nails and old wood. And when he pried it up, dust puffed out with a rancid smell like boiled marrow and bleach, making one of the younger techs gag. And they pulled up a metal tin wrapped in burlap, rusted edges, no markings except a faded sticker with a children's hospital logo. And Haynes radioed in, voice tight, "We've got another container. Looks sealed. Bring hazmat bagging." And when Mira heard that over comms, she grabbed her jacket, saying, "We're going back out there." But Rourke said, "Marion isn't done talking." And right then the observation camera lit up in the interrogation wing, showing Marion with her hands folded, eyes fixed on the door like she sensed someone watching, and the mic picked up her whisper, "They'll come for me tonight." Mira drove alone to the farmhouse because Rourke stayed behind to review the interview tape again, pausing on the moment Marion mentioned the basement, except she hadn't said basement before, not exactly. She'd said, "Where he kept the rest, beneath the soup but above the roots." And Mira kept hearing that phrase in her head like a riddle while the cruiser headlights cut through the fog creeping along the tree line, and dispatch called her mid-drive, "Detective, we just got a report from a retired social worker. Claims Halvorsen threatened her into silence about transferred wards." And Mira said, "What years?" And dispatch said, "Matches Marion's volunteer period." And Mira muttered, "He's tying every loose end before we do." Back at the station, Captain Sloan watched the hallway cameras and noticed a maintenance worker he didn't recognize near the detention wing, rolling a cart with tools that didn't match standard inventory, and he radioed security to intercept. But before they reached him, the man ducked down a service stairwell, abandoning the cart, and inside it were bolt cutters, a syringe, and a keycard clone with Marion Parker's holding cell number scratched into the plastic. And Sloan said, "Lock her down. Now." But the feed to her cell glitched static for 2 full seconds before the backup camera came online and showed Marion standing, palms flat on the table, staring straight up into the lens. Simultaneously, Dr. Havers called Rourke directly, voice strained. The DNA hit came back. The fragment in the soup pot didn't belong to any of Marion's reported children or relatives, but it does match a cold file from 2003, a missing boy from Halvorsen House. And Rourke said, "Name." And Havers said, "Lucas Pereira, age 9. And Rourke felt the room tilt, because Lucas's file was one of the buried reports Captain Sloan mentioned. And if the soup pot held only part of him, where was the rest? And why now? At the farmhouse, Mira and the forensics team pried open the metal tin from the pantry crawl space, and inside were laminated Polaroids stuck together by moisture and time, showing children lined up in a basement hallway, eyes covered with cloth strips, each holding a tin bowl like they were waiting for meals that never came. And in the corner of one picture stood a man, face out of frame but wearing a ring with an insignia that Mira recognized from Halvorsen's university portrait hanging in the courthouse, and she whispered, "He was here. Not just orchestrating, he was present." And one of the techs muttered, "If he knows we found this, he won't run. He'll erase everyone who knows." Back in holding, Marion whispered to herself, but the mic caught every word. "He promised they'd be safe under the floor. He promised he'd take care of the ones I couldn't keep, but he fed them to the broth when the screams got too loud." And the young officer watching the feed swore under his breath and reached for the mute button, trembling. Rourke arrived at the security wing as techs tried to trace the cloned keycard origin, and Sloan said, He has someone on the inside or someone very close. And Rourke said, then we leak nothing until we move on both locations. And Sloane asked, what both? And Rourke said, the farmhouse and his old property records. If he had foster kids off paper, we're going to find ground no one's touched. Across the city, an anonymous package arrived at the Chronicle newsroom, no return label, just a flash drive inside a hollowed-out book of nursery rhymes, and the intern who opened it plugged it into a quarantine laptop and saw a folder titled Cellar Choir, with video files time-stamped from 2001 to 2004. Each showing dim corridors and children's voices muffled through drains, and one frame freezing on a metal soup pot sitting on a cement table like an altar, steam rising only once then, replaced by silence, and the intern backed away in tears before calling the police tip line. Mira radioed Rourke from the farmhouse, voice hushed but urgent. You need to see this yourself. The photos place Halvorsen inside the property during Marion's tenure, and there are drag marks leading toward the storm cellar under the shed, but the door's padlocked with a fresh chain. And Rourke said, don't break it yet, and Mira said, why? And Rourke said, because whatever's inside, he's already moving to destroy, and if we open without backup we lose the only leverage we have. But before she could answer, one of the forensics techs shouted from outside, Detective! Someone's watching from the tree line? And when Mira spun around, her flashlight caught a brief reflection off glass, like binoculars or a scope, and two dark figures melted back into the pines before she could draw her weapon. Marion suddenly stood in her cell, pacing, muttering. He said they'd never dig the east wall, he said the broth was mercy. And the officer outside the door backed away like she was contagious, and Rourke watched through the one-way glass, saying under his breath, she's not afraid of prison, she's afraid he'll get to her first. And Sloane said, then we move her to protective custody. But Rourke said, only after she tells us where the rest are. And as he turned to go back in the hallway, lights flickered once, then again the kind of flicker that means someone's tampering with power feeds. At the exact same moment, the Chronicle editorial desk forwarded the video files to the police digital crimes unit, and the tech specialist pulled Rourke aside to show him a still image from one of the clips, saying, look at the pot. There's a marking on the rim, like a serial stamp, and when they zoomed in you could see an engraved code tied to institutional kitchen inventory from Halvorsen House, and Rourke realized the pot wasn't Marion's original cookware. It was supplied through the home's funding, meaning it was transported intentionally. Mira stood over the storm cellar hatch with two uniforms, the lock now partially cut but not removed, and she said into her radio, if he stored evidence down here, it's not just remains. It could be recordings, documents, things he couldn't burn. And one of the uniforms whispered, Detective, look at this, pointing to a small handprint in dried mud beside the hatch, too small to be adult, and Mira felt something cold run down her spine. Rourke, Sloane, Havers, and the tech team gathered in the briefing room as the first frame of one video was projected onto the wall, showing a dimly lit basement room with rows of metal shelving, and in the corner, half covered by tarp, a stack of soup pots of different sizes, some with lids welded shut, and Rourke said, he's been doing this longer than Marion knew. And Sloane asked, where was this filmed? And the tech said, the metadata's wiped but building codes suggest reinforced. Substructure, not residential. And Rourke said, institutional, like Halvorsen House or somewhere tied to it. As all these moving parts collided, the elevator to the lower holding wing dinged softly, and the maintenance worker with the fake cart badge stepped out wearing a stolen security jacket, a surgical mask, and nitrile gloves, heading toward Marion's cell with calm, deliberate strides, and the last officer in the hall didn't notice him until he was an arm's length away. And just as Detective Mira knelt to remove the last link of the cellar chain, her radio crackled with static followed by a broken whisper. He's inside. But the voice cut off before she could ask who, and she looked over her shoulder at the tree line where the watchers had disappeared. And that was the moment everything began to unravel in two places at once. One above ground and one below, and neither Rourke nor Mira realized that Marion's final hint about beneath the soup but above the roots wasn't about her farmhouse at all, but somewhere even worse, and someone was already unlocking the door to silence her before they put it together. The rain had started before dawn. That steady, whispering kind of downpour that blurs the world into shadows and reflections. Inside the farmhouse, Detective Rourke stood by the kitchen window, his silhouette framed against the flickering police lights outside. The smell of damp earth and copper hung in the air, mixed with something else. Faint, chemical, like bleach trying to erase memory. Mira pushed open the basement door. Her flashlight beams sliced through the darkness, dust dancing like lost souls in the light. She said, "Beneath the soup but above the roots," Mira murmured, stepping down slowly. "Rourke, this isn't about the pot, is it?" Rourke didn't answer. He was looking at the table, the soup pot still sitting there, lid slightly ajar, steam long gone. Inside, residue clung to the edges, congealed, dark, and faintly metallic. "No," he finally said. "It was never about the pot. It was about what she hid under it." Mira froze halfway down the stairs. "You mean the cellar hatch?" "Yeah," Rourke said quietly. "That's not a floorboard. It's a door." The sound of the latch giving way echoed in the silence. When Mira lifted the wooden panel, the stench hit her first. A mix of mold, soil, and something that didn't belong. Her flashlight swept over brick walls slick with condensation. The faint glint of glass jars stacked along a shelf. Some were filled with murky liquid. Some had shapes. "Oh my God," she whispered. "These aren't preserves." Rourke stepped down beside her, his face grim. Marion wasn't just cooking. She was collecting. Outside, the storm deepened. An evidence van arrived, tires crunching against wet gravel. Inside the cellar, every sound was amplified. The slow drip from a pipe, the flutter of a tarp in the corner, Myra's heartbeat pounding in her ears. "Rourke, look at this," she said, pointing her light toward a small wooden chest buried beneath a layer of earth. They dug it out carefully. The hinges were rusted, the lock snapped clean. Inside was a stack of yellowed letters and an old photograph, a young girl standing in front of a well. Behind her, barely visible, was a shadow that didn't match the others. Mira read the first line on the top letter aloud. "To whoever finds this, please don't dig any deeper. What's buried here doesn't sleep." She looked up. What the hell was Marion into? Rourke didn't answer. He was staring at something else. A metal hook embedded in the wall with a frayed rope still tied to it. Hours later, as evidence was being catalogued, a deputy came running up from the cellar. "Sir, there's something under the well outside. We ran the scanner and—" "Show me," Rourke said. They trudged through the mud, flashlights cutting through the storm. The old stone well behind the farmhouse was half collapsed, covered in moss. Mira crouched beside it, brushing away debris. "Marion mentioned this place once," she said. "Said she used to hear voices coming from below." The deputy swallowed. "Sir, the thermal imaging shows something down there. Metal. Maybe a container." Rourke took the rope from the deputy's hands and tied it off. "Get me a harness." Mira grabbed his arm. "You're not going down there alone." He looked at her. Tired eyes, mud on his face, voice low. "Then come with me." The descent was slow. The deeper they went, the colder it became. Water dripped from the stones, echoing like whispers. When Rourke's boots hit the bottom, his light landed on something that made his stomach tighten. A large steel drum, half buried in the mud. "Help me get this open," he said. Together, they pried the lid loose. The smell hit them like a wave. Mira gagged, covering her mouth. Inside was fabric, rags, and beneath that, bone. But what stopped them cold wasn't what was in the drum. It was what was underneath it. A small wooden plaque, barely legible under grime, with one word carved into it. "Roots." Rourke knelt, tracing the letters. "She meant this," he whispered. "Beneath the soup, above the roots." Myra's voice trembled. "Then what's below the roots?" Before he could answer, his radio crackled to life. "Detective, we've got movement on the property perimeter. Someone just came through the north field." Rourke froze. "Identify." Couldn't see a face, just a flashlight. Heading toward the barn. Myra's hand went to her weapon. "Rourke, we sealed this area off. No one's supposed to be out here." Rourke looked up the narrow shaft, the light from above barely reaching them. "We're not alone down here." By the time they reached the surface, the wind had picked up, hard howling, throwing rain sideways. They moved toward the barn, flashlights slicing through the darkness. The door creaked open on its own, as if the storm itself had pushed it. Inside, dust swirled in the air. A faint light flickered in the far corner. Mira whispered, "You see that?" Rourke nodded. "Stay behind me." They approached slowly, each step echoing on the wooden floorboards. When Rourke reached the back, he found a lantern sitting on the ground, still warm. Next to it, muddy footprints, bare feet, leading toward the trapdoor in the floor. "She's been down here," Mira said. "Or someone who knows what she hid," Rourke replied. He knelt, running his hand over the wood. It was freshly disturbed. When he lifted it, a gust of cold air rose up from the darkness. "Rourke," Mira whispered, "we just came from the basement. This connects somewhere else." Rourke's light caught on something inside, a ladder leading down into pitch-black tunnels. And then, faintly, a sound drifted up. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, getting closer. Mira raised her weapon. "Who's down there? Identify yourself." The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then a voice floated up from the darkness. Soft, broken, almost pleading. "You shouldn't have opened it." Mira's hand shook. "Rourke, that voice." "I know," he said. His expression hardened. "It's Marion." The light flickered once, twice, and went out. Above the roar of the storm, a single scream echoed through the barn. And when officers rushed in seconds later, all they found was the lantern, still burning, and the hatch door swinging gently, as if someone had just climbed down. Rourke's radio crackled again, static tearing through the noise. "Mira? Rourke? Are you there? We've just received a call. You're not gonna believe this." The voice on the radio hesitated, trembling. Marion Parker just turned herself in at the county sheriff's office, 40 miles from your location." Rourke stared into the open hatch, the darkness swallowing the last light. "If she's up there," he whispered, "then who the hell is down here?" They thought they'd reached the end when they opened the soup pot. But the truth was still buried deeper than anyone dared to dig. It was just past midnight when Detective Mira Anders stood at the edge of the farmhouse garden, flashlight trembling in her hand. The rain had turned the soil into black sludge, thick and cold. Beneath her boots, the earth pulsed with something that didn't feel right. Behind her, Rourke's voice broke the silence. "Chief said to stop at dawn. We've dug half the yard. Nothing yet." Mira didn't look back. "Then we keep digging." Marion's message wasn't random. Beneath the soup but above the roots. It wasn't about food. It was about layers. Rourke exhaled, watching steam rise from his breath. "You think it's under the kitchen?" She nodded slowly. "No, under everything." They'd spent weeks chasing Marion Parker's cryptic final words. The quiet widow who disappeared after calling 911 and whispering one line before the call went dead. "It's beneath the soup but above the roots. Don't let him see." At first, detectives thought it was delirium. Maybe she was talking about an old recipe or her garden or something left behind by her late husband. But the soup pot had already told them otherwise. Inside, wrapped in wax paper, were photographs. Children, missing ones. And in the corner of every photo, scrawled in the same trembling hand, "Fed but never found." That was the moment everything changed. What they thought was a crime of passion was about to become a revelation no one would ever forget. At 2:14 a.m., the floorboards began to give. Mira was the first to hear it. A low, hollow creak, like a sigh trapped in wood. "Wait," she whispered. "Kill the lights." Rourke hesitated, then switched his beam off. The dark swallowed them whole. Then, faintly, a sound rose beneath their feet. Not wind, not pipes, faint scraping. Someone or something was moving below. "Basement," Rourke muttered, grabbing his flashlight. "We checked it already." "No," Mira said. "We checked a room, not the basement." She knelt by the pantry wall, brushing dust off the floor. The boards were uneven, one slightly lifted at the edge. Her hand trembled as she pried it up. A rush of cold air escaped from below. Sharp, earthy, metallic. What lay beneath that farmhouse had been sealed for years. Not to protect the world from it, but to protect it from the world. The opening led to a narrow tunnel carved through roots and soil, just wide enough for one person to crawl through. The walls were lined with old stones, damp and mossy. Rourke hesitated. This isn't standard procedure. Neither was Marion, Mira replied, gripping her flashlight. You coming or not? They climbed down. The tunnel stretched 30 feet before widening into a chamber. The smell hit them first. Iron and rot, but faintly sweet, like something that had once been preserved and forgotten. In the center stood a wooden table, and on it, another pot, older, cracked with age. Mira approached it slowly, her breath hitching. You've got to be kidding me. The lid lifted easily. Inside was dirt and something buried in it. A box. Carved into the lid were 3 words. For the children. Rourke took a step back. What the hell is this place? Mira brushed the dirt aside and opened the box. Inside were brittle envelopes and a handful of silver pendants. Small, heart-shaped lockets engraved with initials. She read the first one aloud. LM, 2008. Then another. CR, 2011. Each locket matched one of the children in the photos they'd found earlier. Her voice trembled. She kept them. As memorials? Rourke shook his head. No, these weren't hers to keep. Suddenly, a noise. Faint footsteps echoing from the tunnel behind them. Mira froze. Did you hear that? Rourke raised his flashlight, but before he could turn, a shadow appeared at the edge of the beam. A figure stepped forward. Older, gaunt, eyes hollow with years of secrets. Stop, Mira barked. Police. The man smiled, faint, eerie. You shouldn't be here. Rourke's hand went for his weapon. Who are you? The man's gaze flicked toward the pot. The caretaker. Marion couldn't bury everything, you know. She tried. But the roots always grow back. He wasn't lying. Because what the detectives didn't realize was that this man wasn't the killer they were hunting. He was something much worse. Mira steadied her voice. Marion's gone. You knew that, didn't you? He nodded, stepping closer. I told her it wouldn't matter, that they'd still dig, that the truth always seeps through. Rourke raised his gun. Back up. Now. But the man didn't move. He pointed to the ceiling, to a tangle of roots dripping through the dirt above them. She kept them alive down here, he whispered. Fed them, watered them, said she was giving them back to the earth. Myra's pulse spiked. Them? You mean? He smiled again. The ones who never made it home. They didn't find bodies that night. They found growth. Small, mummified remains entwined with roots and vines, the earth having swallowed them over the years. Each one wrapped in the same wax paper that once lined the soup pot upstairs. Rourke could barely breathe. Jesus Christ. Mira backed away, covering her mouth. She didn't kill them for pleasure. She thought she was saving them. The caretaker tilted his head. Saving them from what? Silence. Then Mira whispered. From him. That was the moment the case turned itself inside out. The truth wasn't about what Marion had done. It was about what had been done to her. Records later revealed Marion's first husband, Warren Miles, had run an unlicensed children's home in the 1990s. Missing files, fake adoptions, and hush payments. When investigators looked deeper, they found Eleanor had filed multiple complaints, all ignored. After Warren's death, she'd spent the rest of her life feeding the roots, returning each buried secret she found on the property to the soil, marking their names, keeping their memory alive. The caretaker, her brother, had been helping her maintain it, until he couldn't live with it anymore. When officers escorted him out of the farmhouse, he looked back once and said, "She said the earth forgives what men won't." Mira never forgot those words. Weeks later, forensic teams unearthed 12 remains beneath the property, each identified through DNA from old missing persons cases stretching nearly 2 decades. Marion's name, once whispered with suspicion, became synonymous with tragic penance. A woman haunted by a man's crimes, who chose to preserve the evidence when no one else would. Rourke stood by the garden one last time, watching dawn spill across the soil. "She was right," he said quietly. "It really was beneath the soup and above the roots." Mira nodded, her voice trembling. "And now the roots can finally rest. In the end, justice doesn't always come from the courts. Sometimes, it grows from the ground up." Marion's story reminds us that even when truth is buried deep, it still finds a way to break through. But before this case closed for good, there was one final discovery. Because weeks after the farmhouse was sealed, a new call came in. A neighbor, cleaning her attic across the street, found something taped to the inside of a wooden beam, a torn photograph. On the back, scrawled in Marion's handwriting, were just 4 words: "He wasn't the last." And that is where the next story begins. What they found in that photograph would lead detectives to a second farmhouse, 50 miles away, and a trail that would prove Marion's warning was only the beginning. Subscribe if you want to see how deep this goes, because in the next case, the roots aren't buried. They're still alive. Subscribe for more true crime breakdowns, unsolved mysteries, and AI-narrated investigations. The next story drops soon. Until then, ask yourself, if you found something buried in your backyard, would you dare to dig? Thanks for watching my channel, The Medusa Effects, where crimes that petrify the society are told.